In a quiet town surrounded by green hills and narrow cobblestone streets, lived a woman who most people knew very little about. She worked at the local school library, where the scent of old pages filled the air and sunlight filtered gently through tall windows. Her days passed quietly sorting books, helping students find stories, and keeping everything in neat order. No one in town really knew where she came from or why she always carried that calm, gentle smile. She lived alone in a small apartment above a bakery, where the smell of fresh bread drifted in every morning. She greeted people politely but never stayed long to chat. To most, she was simply the quiet librarian who always looked content, though her eyes often carried a faraway sadness that no one questioned. There was something curious about her, though. Every time she walked through the school hallway, she slowed near the old piano that stood covered in dust in the assembly hall. Sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, her fingers brushed softly across the keys, almost as if she were touching a memory rather than an instrument. The piano hadn't been played in years. Its lid was scratched and a few of the keys had yellowed with time. But each time she passed it, her steps grew slower, her expression softer. Students noticed it occasionally. Some whispered that she must have been a pianist once, though no one had proof. Others thought she was simply curious, like anyone else might be when they see something old and beautiful. The teachers who had been at the school for many years had their own quiet guesses. One of them once told another, "You can see it in her hands, the way her fingers move when she picks up papers or turns pages. Those are pianist's hands." But she never talks about it, and it was true. She never mentioned music. Not once. Her days were simple. She woke early, drank tea by the window, and walked to school through a small park filled with morning birds. During lunch breaks, while others chatted in the staff room, she often stayed in the library, lost in old books or humming softly to herself. She loved listening to the laughter of children as they played outside. But every now and then, a sound from a distance, like a song from a nearby cafe or a child learning piano, made her stop for a moment, her eyes dimming with something unspoken. Once, during a school talent show, one of the students struggled with her piano performance. The melody stumbled and broke halfway, and the girl froze on stage. The librarian standing at the back felt her hands twitch slightly, as if her body remembered exactly what to do. She wanted to step forward to help, but she stayed still. She clapped kindly at the end, smiling at the young girl as she left the stage in tears. Later, she found her sitting alone in the hallway. "You played beautifully," she said gently. The girl shook her head. "No, I messed up." She sat beside her. "You didn't mess up. You just forgot to breathe. Music is not about perfect notes. It's about feeling." The girl looked up, curious. "How do you know that?" The librarian hesitated. For a moment, her past almost escaped her lips. But then she smiled softly and said, "Because I've heard enough music to know what it sounds like when someone plays from the heart." The girl smiled a little, and that was enough for her. But when the girl left, she sat there for a while longer, staring at her own reflection in a trophy case across the hallway. The face that looked back at her was calm and still, but behind that calmness lay years of silence. Silence that once used to be filled with music. Long ago, she had been different. Music had once been her entire life. The piano had been her voice, her escape, her way of telling stories without words. She had performed on stages, played in small theaters, and even composed her own melodies that people loved. Her world back then was filled with applause, dreams, and the promise of a bright future. But life has a way of changing direction when least expected. One night after a concert, a terrible accident changed everything. The memory of that night still lived deep within her, even though she tried hard to bury it. The sound of sirens, the flashing lights, the feeling of something being torn away forever, all of it was burned into her heart. After that, she stopped playing. Not just because her hands were injured, but because her spirit was. Every time she looked at a piano, she saw everything she had lost. And so she walked away from it, from the stage, from music, from the world that had once meant everything to her. She moved to a smaller town, far from anyone who recognized her name. She found work at the library because it was quiet, peaceful, and predictable. The silence there didn't hurt as much as the silence of a piano. Years passed like that, slow, steady, uneventful. But something about this town slowly began to warm her heart again. Maybe it was the way people greeted each other with kindness, or how the children ran through the halls with laughter. Maybe it was how the old piano in the school hall reminded her that music was still waiting, patient, forgiving, and alive. One afternoon, when everyone had gone home, she walked into the empty hall. The golden light of sunset poured through the windows, dust floating in the air like tiny stars. She approached the piano and ran her hand gently across the keys. The sound that came from them was faint and slightly out of tune, but it carried something familiar, something she had missed deeply. She sat down slowly. For a long time she just stared at the keys. Then, almost without realizing, her fingers pressed one note, then another. The soft melody echoed through the empty room, hesitant and fragile, as if afraid of breaking the silence. It was clumsy at first, her fingers stiff from years of disuse, but the more she played, the more her heart began to open. Memories returned, not of pain, but of joy, of mornings spent practicing, of smiles shared with someone who believed in her, of moments when music felt like sunlight. Then, as suddenly as she started, she stopped. Her hands fell to her lap. Tears filled her eyes, not from sadness but from the deep ache of remembering who she once was. She stood up quickly, closed the piano lid, and walked out before anyone could see her. That night she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard that melody again. The one she used to play long ago, the one she had promised herself never to touch again. In the following days, she avoided walking past the hall. But her heart had already awakened something she couldn't silence. Whenever she saw a child holding a violin or heard a song on the radio, it stirred something inside her. One morning she came to school earlier than usual. The hall was empty, quiet, and filled with the golden glow of sunrise. The piano stood waiting. She stood there for a long time, torn between fear and longing. Then she slowly lifted the lid again. This time she didn't play a full melody, just a few soft notes. But those notes were enough. They were a promise, not to the audience she once had, but to herself. From that day onward, she began to visit the piano whenever the school was empty. She played quietly, softly, never for anyone to hear. It was her secret, her small way of breathing again. The music was not perfect, but it was honest. It spoke of pain, healing, and hope. No one in town knew about it. To everyone, she was still the quiet librarian who loved books and rarely spoke about her life. But inside those walls, during those silent afternoons, she was something more. She was a woman rediscovering the language she once lost. Sometimes a janitor passing by would pause, hearing faint music through the closed door, and smile. He never said anything. He knew better than to interrupt someone who had finally found their way back to what they loved. In those secret hours, her heart began to change. She realized that maybe music had never left her. Maybe it had just waited, patiently, quietly, until she was ready to listen again. She still didn't know if she would ever perform in front of others again. The thought of it still scared her. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel like running from her past. She began to understand that her story wasn't over. It had only paused. And somewhere deep down, beneath the quiet rhythm of her days, she knew that the piano, that old, dusty piano in the school hall, would soon become the bridge between who she was and who she could be again. The sound of the piano still echoed in her mind days after she had dared to touch its keys again. It was strange how something that had once brought her so much pain could now feel like a heartbeat she had forgotten she had. She went about her daily work as usual, helping students, sorting books, and smiling when people greeted her. But her thoughts often drifted back to that moment in the empty hall. Every time she passed by the piano now, her eyes lingered just a little longer. The lid was always closed, the keys hidden beneath a thin layer of dust. She wondered if anyone else ever played it. It seemed lonely, just sitting there waiting, much like she had been waiting without realizing it. One afternoon, while putting away returned books, she found an old music sheet tucked between two encyclopedias. It was worn, edges yellowed with time, and had faint pencil marks of finger positions and notes. She turned it over and read the title. It was a piece she had learned when she was very young, back when her world revolved around the piano. Her breath caught for a moment. She traced the faint lines of notes with her finger and smiled softly. That night, after everyone had left the school, she went to the hall again. The air was quiet except for the hum of the lights. She placed the sheet on the piano stand, sat down slowly, and began to play. Her hands moved cautiously at first, but as the familiar melody filled the space, she felt a warmth spreading through her chest. For a brief while, she wasn't the quiet librarian anymore. She was once again the young girl who dreamed big, who played for the joy of it, who believed that music could heal everything. She could almost hear her younger brother's laughter echoing beside her, the way he used to tease her when she played too seriously. Then she stopped, her fingers freezing mid-air. The sound of his laughter in her mind faded, replaced by silence. The ache that followed was deep, pulling her back to a time she tried so hard to forget. After that night, she couldn't sleep again. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, her heart heavy with memories. It had been so long since she allowed herself to remember him. Her younger brother had been her biggest supporter, her best friend, the one who believed in her when she didn't believe in herself. They used to play together, she on the piano, he on the violin. Their small performances at local events had been full of laughter and shared dreams. They had promised to one day perform on the biggest stages in the world. That promise had broken the night of the accident. She could still remember the smell of rain on the road, the lights blurring through the car window, the sound of tires sliding, and then the crash, that awful sound that never left her mind. Her brother had been sitting beside her. She had survived with minor injuries, but his life ended that night. The guilt of it crushed her. She blamed herself for convincing him to come along. She blamed herself for surviving when he didn't, and worst of all, she blamed music. Because it was music that had brought them there that night. After the funeral, she couldn't bear to touch the piano again. Her hands trembled whenever she tried. Each note felt like a reminder of what she had lost. So she walked away from it all. She sold her piano, packed her few things, and moved far from the city that held too many memories. For years, she lived quietly, avoiding anything that reminded her of music. Even the sound of a tune on the radio made her turn it off. She told herself she was fine, that she had made peace with her past. But deep inside, she knew it wasn't true. She hadn't healed. She had only hidden. Now, after all these years, sitting at that old piano in the school hall brought everything back. Not the pain of losing him, but the love they shared through music. She realized that the reason she had avoided playing wasn't because she hated it. It was because it reminded her of how much she loved it. And love once lost is hard to face again. The next day, she went to the park after work and sat on a bench under a tree. Children were playing, chasing each other, their laughter echoing in the air. Watching them, she thought about her brother again. He had been full of life, always smiling, always finding joy even in small things. He wouldn't have wanted her to stop playing. He had once told her, "If anything ever happens to me, promise me you won't stop the music." She had promised, and then broken that promise. Tears welled in her eyes as she realized how far she had drifted from the person she used to be. But maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe she could still keep that promise even after all this time. That evening, when she returned home, she opened an old box she hadn't touched in years. Inside were a few photos, a concert program, and a small silver pendant shaped like a treble clef. A gift from her brother on her 18th birthday. Beneath it all was a folded letter in his handwriting. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were still clear. He had written it before their last performance together. It said, "You were born to play no matter what happens. Don't ever forget who you are when you're at the piano. That's where your heart speaks." She held the letter close and whispered, "I'm sorry." Her voice trembled, but there was strength behind it this time, a strength she hadn't felt in years. The following week, she began visiting the school hall more often. Each day after work, she stayed back a little longer. The janitor would see her sitting at the piano and quietly lock up the rest of the building, leaving her to play in peace. The melodies she played were soft, sometimes broken, but they were full of feeling. Slowly, her fingers began to regain their flow. Her confidence grew, bit by bit. She didn't play for anyone but herself. Yet sometimes, when a teacher passed by the hall, they paused, surprised by the gentle music floating through the door. They never asked who was playing. Perhaps they already knew. As days turned into weeks, the piano began to change too. The dust disappeared from its surface, the keys grew brighter from her touch, and the room started to feel alive again. Music had returned to the school in the simplest, quietest way. One afternoon, while she was playing, a student peeked through the door and gasped softly. The sound startled her, and she turned around quickly. The little boy looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry," he said shyly. "I just wanted to listen." It sounded nice. She smiled, surprised by her own calmness. "It's all right," she said. "Do you like music?"
He nodded eagerly.
"My mom says I can't play because we don't have a piano." She thought for a moment, then said, "You can come listen anytime you want." From then on, the boy often sat quietly near the back of the hall while she played. He didn't talk much, but his presence made her feel lighter. She realized that maybe her music could mean something again, not just to her but to others too. As the weeks went by, word began to spread among students that the librarian could play the piano beautifully. Some would peek in through the windows during practice. At first she felt nervous being watched, but she noticed their faces, curious, amazed, sometimes inspired, and it made her heart soften. She was slowly learning that music didn't need to be perfect to touch people. One evening, as she was locking up the library, the school principal stopped by. "I heard someone playing in the hall after hours," he said with a smile. "It's you, isn't it?" She hesitated, unsure how to respond. "It's wonderful," he added warmly. "You should play at our next community event. We're organizing a fundraiser next month, and everyone would love to hear you." Her heart skipped a beat. "Oh, I don't think I could." "Think about it," he said kindly. "Sometimes sharing your gift can heal others, and yourself too." After he left, she stood there in the quiet hallway, the echo of his words lingering in her mind. The thought of playing in front of others again terrified her, but deep inside, a small spark of courage began to grow. That night, she looked at her brother's letter again. Maybe it was time. Maybe this was the moment he had always wanted for her. The moment she would find her way back to music, not as a performer chasing perfection, but as someone who finally understood its true meaning. She smiled faintly, wiped her tears, and whispered into the silence, "I think I'm ready." The idea of playing in front of people again stayed in her mind like a quiet whisper she couldn't ignore. Every day she told herself it was impossible, that she wasn't ready, that she didn't belong on a stage anymore. But every night, as she sat by her small window with a cup of tea, she found herself thinking about it. The thought scared her, yet it also made her heart beat in a way it hadn't in years. The school's community event was only a few weeks away. It was meant to raise money for a children's hospital nearby, and everyone in town was getting involved. There were teachers preparing decorations, students practicing songs, and local families volunteering food and prizes. The air was filled with excitement. One afternoon, while she was shelving books, the principal stopped by again. "Have you thought about the event?" he asked with a hopeful smile. She hesitated, holding a book against her chest. "I'm not sure I could perform," she said softly. He nodded kindly. "It doesn't have to be anything fancy. Just a piece from the heart. That's what people remember." She smiled faintly, but inside her mind was in turmoil. The thought of sitting before an audience again made her hands tremble. What if she froze? What if she played wrong notes? What if the memories came flooding back and she couldn't continue? That evening, after everyone had gone home, she sat in the hall again. The piano looked different now. Not as silent as before, almost as if it was waiting for her decision. She sat down and placed her fingers on the keys. She began to play softly, letting the music flow without overthinking it. The notes filled the room, weaving through the quiet air like an old friend whispering comfort. She closed her eyes, feeling the melody instead of thinking about it. The sound was uneven at first, but soon it found its rhythm. It was gentle, full of emotion, not perfect but real. When she finished, she sat still for a long time. Then she whispered to herself, "Maybe I can try." That night she made her decision. She would perform, not for recognition, not for anyone's approval, but to honor the memory of her brother and the part of herself she had lost. Over the next few days, she began to prepare. After work, she stayed late, practicing alone in the hall. She played the same piece again and again until the melody felt natural in her fingers. Sometimes she stopped midway, her eyes filling with tears, but she never walked away this time. Word spread quietly among a few teachers that the librarian would be performing at the event. Some were surprised, others were simply happy. The little boy who often watched her play was the most excited. "I'll sit in the front row," he told her one morning, grinning from ear to ear. She laughed softly and said, "Then I'll have to play my best." The closer the day came, the more nervous she became. Her stomach twisted whenever she thought about stepping on stage. At night, she dreamt of her brother sitting beside her again, his violin resting against his shoulder, smiling like he always did before a performance. She often woke up with tears on her pillow, but instead of sadness, she felt a strange calm. It was as if he was telling her it was time. The night before the event, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window watching the streetlights flicker. The small pendant her brother had given her all those years ago hung from her neck. She held it gently and whispered, "I'll do it for you." The next morning, the school buzzed with life. Balloons lined the hallways, and the sound of laughter and chatter filled the air. She helped organize books for a charity stall before quietly slipping into the hall to check the piano. She pressed a few keys, making sure they still sounded right. The familiar warmth of the instrument calmed her a little. When evening came, the hall filled quickly. Families, students, and townspeople gathered, their voices blending into a low hum of excitement. The lights dimmed as the first few acts began, children singing, teachers reading poems, a local band playing cheerful tunes. She stood behind the curtain, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. Her hands felt cold and she could barely breathe. For a moment she thought about backing out, about slipping away quietly before anyone noticed. But then she looked toward the front row. The little boy was sitting there, smiling and waving. She also saw the principal giving her an encouraging nod. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. As she walked onto the stage, the chatter slowly faded. People clapped politely, curious to see what the quiet librarian was about to do. She sat down at the piano, her hands hovering above the keys. For a few seconds, the world seemed to stand still. The stage lights were warm on her face, and she could feel the eyes of everyone in the room watching her. Her heart pounded, but she took another deep breath and let her fingers fall gently on the keys. The first notes were soft, uncertain, like whispers from an old memory. Then, little by little, the music grew stronger. Her fingers began to move with purpose, guided not by fear but by emotion. The melody told a story of pain, loss, hope, and healing. It was her story. As she played, images filled her mind. Her brother's laughter, their childhood home, the last performance they shared. For the first time in years, she didn't push the memories away. She welcomed them. She played as if she were speaking to him, as if he were still beside her. The music became her way of saying everything she never had the courage to say out loud. The audience sat completely silent, captivated. Some closed their eyes, letting the emotion of the music wash over them. Others watched her intently, moved by the depth in every note. It was as if the piano itself had come alive through her touch. When she reached the final part, her hands trembled slightly, but she didn't stop. She played the last line, a quiet, haunting finish that lingered in the air long after her fingers lifted from the keys. For a few moments, there was only silence. Then the room erupted into applause. People stood, clapping, cheering, wiping their eyes. The sound was overwhelming, yet all she could do was sit there, her eyes glistening, her heart lighter than it had felt in years. The little boy in the front row was clapping the loudest. His face was full of joy, and she smiled through her tears. After the performance, many people came to her, telling her how beautiful it was, how deeply it touched them. She thanked them quietly, her voice trembling with emotion. The principal shook her hand and said, "You didn't just play music tonight. You told a story." Later that night, when everyone had gone and the hall was empty again, she returned to the piano. She sat there in the soft glow of the stage lights, tracing her fingers over the keys one last time. This time there was no sadness, no fear. Just peace. She whispered softly. "We did it," as if speaking to her brother. For a long time, she stayed there, listening to the quiet hum of the building, feeling the weight of the years finally lift off her shoulders. She realized that music had never really left her. It had always been there, waiting patiently for her to find her courage again. When she finally left the hall, the night air was cool and calm. The stars above seemed brighter than usual. She walked home slowly, her heart full, her steps light. For the first time in a very long time, she felt alive, not as the quiet librarian everyone knew, but as the person she truly was. And deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning. The morning after her performance, the town felt different. The air was brighter, lighter somehow, as if the entire place carried a little bit of the music she had played the night before. When she arrived at the school, people greeted her with smiles that seemed warmer than usual. Students waved excitedly, and even the teachers stopped to tell her how wonderful her performance had been. She smiled politely, still not used to the attention. Compliments made her nervous, but deep down, she couldn't deny the quiet pride she felt. After years of silence, she had finally found her courage again, and it showed. The little boy who had promised to sit in the front row came running into the library during break time. "You were amazing," he said, grinning from ear to ear. "My mom cried when you played." She laughed softly, touched by his excitement. "That's very kind of you," she said. "I'm glad you liked it." He nodded seriously. "I want to learn to play just like you." Those words made her heart melt. She crouched down beside him and said, "Then you must promise to practice even when it's hard. Music listens to those who don't give up." The boy nodded again, determination shining in his eyes. That simple moment reminded her why music mattered, not just for herself but for others too. Later that day, the principal stopped by the library with a smile. "You've started something beautiful," he said. "Someone from the town recorded your performance last night. They shared it online and it's spreading fast. People can't stop talking about it." She blinked in surprise. "They recorded it?" He chuckled. "Yes, and you should see the comments. People are calling it one of the most heartfelt performances they've ever heard." She felt her heart skip. The thought of strangers watching her play made her nervous, but at the same time, she felt a deep sense of wonder. Her story, her music, was reaching people she had never met. That evening, when she got home, she hesitated before opening her laptop. Curiosity eventually won. She searched for the video, and there it was. A simple recording of her sitting at the piano, the light soft on her face, her hands moving gently across the keys. The caption read, "The secret pianist who touched everyone's heart." She clicked play. Watching herself felt surreal. The camera had captured not only the music but the emotion behind it. The comments below were filled with kind words. "I don't even know her, but this made me cry. There's so much pain and beauty in this performance. She reminded me of why I fell in love with music." Tears welled in her eyes. For years she had been afraid to share her music because she thought no one would understand. Yet here were hundreds of people who did, people who felt what she had poured into every note. She sat back, letting it sink in. The video had given her story a new life. But more than that, it reminded her that music was never meant to be hidden. It was meant to be shared, to connect hearts even between strangers. The next few days were a blur. Reporters reached out, wanting to know more about the mystery pianist. Parents came by the school, thanking her for inspiring their children. Some even asked if she could start teaching music. At first she hesitated. It had been so long since she had taught anyone, but the idea stayed with her. Maybe this was her chance to give back. After a week of thinking, she decided to open a small evening class for students who wanted to learn piano. She didn't advertise it. Word simply spread on its own. On the first day, 5 children showed up, nervous, excited, and curious. She smiled warmly at them. "We're not here to chase perfection," she said. "We're here to feel the music. Let's begin." As the days went by, the classroom filled with laughter, wrong notes, and joy. She taught them not just how to press keys, but how to listen, how to feel, and how to express themselves through sound. The same lessons her brother had once taught her, she now passed on to them. One evening, as she was packing up after class, she looked around the room and smiled. The piano, which had once been a symbol of loss, now stood for something entirely new: hope, growth, and connection. But her journey wasn't without moments of reflection. Sometimes, when she was alone, she still thought about her brother. The memory of him never faded, but now it no longer hurt the same way. It felt peaceful, as if he was still there, watching over her. One night, as she sat by her window, she took out the old pendant again and whispered, "You'd be proud, wouldn't you?" The moonlight shimmered against the small silver charm, and she felt a calm warmth spread through her chest. A few weeks later, she was invited to perform at a charity concert in the city, the same city she had once left behind. When she read the invitation, her hands trembled slightly. Returning there meant facing everything she had run from. But deep inside, she knew it was something she needed to do. The school staff encouraged her. "You've inspired so many people here," the principal said. "Imagine how many more you could touch if you shared your story beyond this town." She nodded slowly, her heart filled with both fear and excitement. The night before she left, her students gathered around her with handmade cards. The little boy handed her one that said, "You taught us that courage sounds like music." Those words stayed with her as she packed her things. When she arrived in the city, memories came rushing back. The tall buildings, the busy streets, the theater she had once performed in. But this time it didn't feel like the same place. She was different now. She wasn't the broken girl who had run away years ago. She was a woman who had rebuilt herself through every note she played. The concert was held in a grand hall filled with people from all walks of life. She was one of several performers, but when her turn came, the lights dimmed and the crowd fell silent. She sat at the piano, hands resting gently on the keys, heart steady. She began to play. Not the same piece from the school, but a new one she had written herself. It was a song of remembrance, of letting go, of love that never fades. The melody rose and fell like the rhythm of her own heart, telling her story without words. Halfway through the piece, she felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but she didn't stop. Every emotion she had ever held inside poured out through her fingertips. The audience could feel it too. Some wept quietly. Others closed their eyes, lost in the sound. When the last note faded, there was silence again, the kind that holds meaning. Then the applause came, filling the hall with warmth and gratitude. People stood clapping for her not just as a pianist, but as someone who had turned her pain into beauty. After the show, strangers came up to her, thanking her for the music. One woman said, "I lost someone too, but tonight you reminded me that healing is possible." That night, as she walked out of the theater, she felt the cool breeze against her face and smiled. It was as if the city itself was welcoming her back. She whispered softly, "I did it." Back in her hotel room, she opened her phone to find countless messages from her students, the school staff, and people from her town, all cheering her on. The video from the concert had already started spreading online too. People called her performance the heroic melody, saying it felt like a song that carried both pain and strength. She didn't think of herself as a hero, though. She was just someone who had finally found her voice again. But seeing how her story touched others filled her with quiet joy. Before going to bed, she took out her brother's letter once more. The words still glowed with life. "You were born to play no matter what happens. Don't ever forget who you are when you're at the piano." She smiled through tears and whispered, "I didn't forget this time." When she returned to the small town days later, the children greeted her with flowers and laughter. The school held a small assembly to celebrate her success. As she looked around at their bright faces, she realized that the music she once thought had ended had only changed its form. It now lived through others, through the children, through every person who found courage because of her. The quiet librarian who once hid behind silence had become someone else entirely, a symbol of hope, of healing, of what happens when you face your fears and choose to play again. And though she never said it out loud, she knew in her heart that her brother's spirit had guided her to this moment. His love had never left her. It had simply waited until she was ready to listen again. After her performance in the city, life in the small town began to change for her in subtle ways. People no longer just saw her as the quiet librarian. They began to notice the way she moved, the calm confidence in her smile and the warmth in her eyes. But most importantly, they noticed how her music seemed to touch everyone around her. Her students at the school had grown even more eager. The little boy who had once peeked through the piano hall now sat at the front, practicing diligently every evening. Other children joined, inspired by the news of her performance. She began teaching more students, expanding her small class into something she had never imagined. Each child was different, some timid, some full of energy, some nervous about performing, but she treated them all the same, guiding them with patience, understanding, and gentle encouragement. She told them stories of her own journey, carefully leaving out the painful parts that might frighten them, but sharing enough to teach them about courage, dedication, and the importance of feeling music instead of simply playing notes. She encouraged them to listen to their hearts, to let every mistake become part of the story, and to play with honesty. The children flourished. Their confidence grew as they discovered their own voices through the lessons. They laughed, stumbled over wrong notes, and cheered each other on. And through it all, she felt a quiet joy she had never felt in years. A joy rooted not just in music, but in connection, in giving and receiving care, in seeing lives change because of something she had once thought was gone forever. Meanwhile, the video of her city performance continued to spread. Strangers reached out with messages of gratitude and admiration. Some wrote long letters explaining how her music had comforted them during difficult times. Others said it reminded them of lost loved ones. Some admitted they had never truly listened to music before, but her performance had made them feel. Though the attention was overwhelming at times, she focused on the quiet moments, teaching her students, playing in the empty hall and letting the music speak for itself. The world beyond the town was vast, but she learned that she didn't need to chase recognition. The real impact was in the lives she touched directly, in the smiles of children and in the comfort of strangers who heard her notes online. Months passed, and she began composing more pieces herself. They were inspired by life, by her brother, by the emotions she had once buried deep inside. She wrote songs of hope, of memory, of loss, and of resilience. She titled one piece, "For You Always," a melody that carried the story of her brother's love, the accident that had broken her, and the courage it had taken to return to music. When she played it, tears often filled her eyes, but it was a healing kind of sorrow, one that reminded her of love's enduring presence. One afternoon, a reporter came from a national music magazine. They wanted to interview her about her journey and the heroic masterpiece she had created. She agreed, but insisted on keeping the focus on the music itself rather than herself. The interview was published online, with hundreds of comments from people moved by her story and the honesty of her music. People began requesting performances at other venues. A small concert was arranged in a nearby city, this time for a children's foundation. She accepted, thinking only of sharing the music with more people and inspiring courage. She brought her students along, letting them watch from the audience, hoping they would see that music could be more than just notes on a page. It could be life itself. On the night of the concert, the hall was packed. When she walked onto the stage, she felt the familiar flutter of nerves, but it was accompanied by a quiet strength she hadn't felt before. The piano waited for her just as it always had, patient and ready to speak. She played "For You Always," her fingers flowing over the keys with ease. Every note was deliberate, every pause meaningful. The melody carried through the room like a story without words, telling of loss, love, courage, and hope. For the first time in years, she felt completely free, not thinking about mistakes, not worrying about judgments, just letting the music flow. The audience sat in silence, captivated. Children listened wide-eyed, parents held their hands over their hearts, and strangers leaned forward, drawn into the emotions of the piece. When the last note lingered in the air, there was a moment of complete stillness, a silence that spoke louder than applause. Then the clapping came. It started softly, then grew into a thunderous ovation. People stood cheering, some with tears in their eyes. She bowed gently, her heart full, her eyes glistening. Afterward, she stayed back to speak with a few audience members. Many told her the piece had healed a part of them, had reminded them of someone they had lost, or had given them hope to keep moving forward. Others simply thanked her for letting the music speak when words could not. Returning to her small town, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Music, which had once been a source of sorrow, had become a bridge, connecting her past and present, herself and others, memory and hope. The piano in the school hall was no longer just an instrument. It was a symbol of resilience, of courage, and of love that transcends time. The little boy who had inspired her to play again proudly showed off his growing skills. Other children began performing small pieces during school events, their confidence growing with each note. She encouraged them quietly, never boasting, never drawing attention to herself, but letting them shine. Watching them, she felt her brother's presence in a gentle way, as if he was smiling, proud of what she had become, and happy to see the music continue.